We'll talk a few things about fracture of the phalanges. If the fracture is irreducible, it requires surgery. If the fracture is reducible but slips, requires surgery. If the fracture is reducible and stays reduced, you can conserve it. This article, which came in 2008, it said despite high number of fractures, the literature is unclear and there is no guidance what is to be done to various fractures. And what that it means to me? That means to me there are a lot of options which are available, and the best is what gives your patient satisfaction. It's not that what gives you satisfaction. People are applying left, right and center fixators, creating more havoc. And therefore it's not that what gives you satisfaction, it is what gives the patient satisfaction. And there are various options available here. Even bone pegs, I put in graft here, bone grafts have been used to stabilize. K-wires, a single wire, double wires, intermedullary wire, through the joint wires, outside the joint, various options are available. Stainless steel cerclage wires, tension bend wires are available. Combinations of wires and stainless steel wires are available. Screws alone with plates are available, and external fixers. These are the various modalities that are available to us. But what are the core principles? The core principles are, if it's an articular fracture, you need an... Thank you very much. If it's an articular fracture, you need an anatomical reduction. If it's an extra-articular fracture, you need to restore the anatomy. But what is basically important is you have to have a stable fixation. When I say stable, you don't need a rigid fixation. You need a stable fixation, and that too with minimum soft tissue damage. And to top it up, you need a very early range of motion, probably the same evening. The first principle that I talked to you was articular fracture injuries here, intra-articular fractures. You have to have a step off of less than 1 millimeter here. And when I say restore anatomical relations, what is the important thing? You see a fracture, you might say some degree of a step off at the fracture site, but no, what you need to see is clinically. Clinically, whether there is shortening, there is angulation, there is rotation, or there is pseudo-clawing. If these things are there, you need to get the bones into alignment here. It is the anatomical reduction is less important. These things are more important here. And the third thing I said is stable fixation is very important. It is not the rigidity of the fracture. I'll come to that in a little while here. K-wires, there are various types of applications which are available here. This is a bill bouquet or bouquet technique where you have a hole in the side and you enter your wire from the side here. This is the way it has been shown here. I'm not going into the details for certain reasons here because there are better things to understand at the end of the talk here. Bill bouquet techniques here. The techniques where the wires have been passed through the extra bone here, the metacarpal here, so that the MP joint is temporarily immobilized and fracture stability has been achieved here. But what in the end you get here is you do not get MP joint movement, but what you do get is movement of the PIP joint immediately here. The same thing here, fractures, two cross K wires here. And there are various concerns which have been raised when these K wires are fixed. The concerns are there is a loss of reduction, there is a tethering of the soft tissue, primarily the extensor tendons here, there is spin track infection and potentially can lead to osteomyelitis here. And this was published way back in 92, and they rated a complication rate of 18%, including infection of 7%, pin loosening of 5%, and non-union of another 4%. But what is important, whether this is the K-wire which is failing or it is a failure of the surgeon or it is a failure of the technique. Which K-wire was used is not mentioned. Whether you are using a diamond tip or you are using a trocar tip, and what kind of drill you are using, whether you are using a dental tip at 20,000 RPM or 600 RPM, that are all variables here. What is the status of the bone here? It's an osteoporotic bone or it's a villager in our country. So that all makes a big difference when it comes to using the K-wires and their failure or success. And ultimately, when you're comparing these two K-wires, the one with trocar tip is far more stable than a diamond tip here. In our place, we have a tendency to reuse the K-wire some of the places here. Whether you are using this kind of K-wire, you're definitely going to have a loosening of the wires here. And whether you have a tip which is beveled like this here, this big or this short, and this all makes a difference. And ultimately what you basically require is fixation, which are the firm holding here. Otherwise you will definitely have these problems here. And therefore, to sum up here at least, do not use a K-wire again and again, especially if it is a blunt tipped here. Platings, is that a panacea? Yes, sure enough, you put a plate on the middle phalanx, you'll have this kind of exposure of the plate here. And therefore it does not work really here. And therefore, whether it is the implant which makes a difference, no, probably what you need is a safe surgeon and not a safe implant here. For the K-wires, the advantage is easy to apply, easy to remove, it is cheap, least dissection, but there are disadvantages which have been attributed to K-wires here. You need an additional immobilization. So what's the big difference? What's the big deals? You can apply a plaster if you have a stable fixation. It has been alleged that K-wires have a disadvantage. There is a pin track infection. I still have to see one. There is allegation that the K-wires have a pin migration. Yes, sure, you have a pin migration, but it's extremely rare. I've seen only one in my lifetime. That does not mean road accidents occur, but will you stop driving a vehicle? It has been alleged that there is no compression at the fracture site, but is it really needed, or you just need a bone contact here? Occasionally may distract, so sure you know that, so therefore watch out for that. It has been alleged that K-wires have no rigidity, but you don't need rigidity, you need only stability there. What about plate fixation? Total range of motion of less than 180 degree. Complication rate 50%. Wow. Another paper, total range of motion of only 11%. So 90% were not doing well with plating in this paper. Other paper, 2004, 82% have problems. So plate is not a panacea also. This is a busy slide, but what I am trying to highlight here in this busy slide, way back in 93 only, 5 types of fixation. Don't try to read whatever, but various combinations were tried here. But what is important to do, intramedullary K-wire significantly weaker in withstanding torsional force. Torsional forces, twisting forces. So why don't you want to twist? The patient has to be mad to attempt twisting the finger. You don't really need a twisting force there. But what is important here is a single intramedullary wire is adequate. So in spite of trying everything, what they conclude in the 93s, intramedullary K-wire is adequate for achieving fixation here. What about K-wire versus plate? Sure, plate has a greater stability, but how much you really require here? You don't require a lot of stability. You just require a stable fixation, nothing more than that here. Biomechanical studies, what it says, other techniques may be favored for reasons other than biomechanics, way back in 13. So other techniques may be favored. So don't really have to go by what is proved in the laboratory here. What is often forgotten when we are using a single K-wire is, they have a fracture pattern. It's not a sharp cut at the fracture end. There's a fracture pattern there which provides inherent stability because of the jigsaw kind of arrangement that is seen in most of the fractures. A single K-wire can often serve our purpose when it comes to stability here. So if you can get away with this thing, do you really require all these things here? There are ever evolving newer techniques here. This was 3 millimeter wire, right through the metacarpal. Woo! The cartilage is all fired here. And then at the end they say, it is not our intention to suggest this is the technique, our standard technique. It's a viable alternative. It's an alternative. You really don't have to do this thing here. Binu is here. This came in the Journal of Hand Surgery here. Protected, they use this kind of fixation, K-wire with a cerclage wire. Protected from unwanted, unprotected movement. So you still have to protect it. You still have to provide a wire. You still have to provide a plaster here. The patient remains off work for 6 weeks. Single K-wire still remains 6 weeks off the work. Hospital stay 8 days. That's misuse of the hospital system, Binu. Range of motion delayed by 3 days. With the single K-wire, you can start almost immediately here. You don't really have to do this kind of dissection unless your wire fixation is repeatedly failing here. Other paper came in Journal of Hand Surgery here. They talked of safe corridors of wire fixation. Ultimately, there are no safe zones. You need a safe surgeon. You need a safe technique. Misuse, democracy in surgery. Left and right and center, you see external fixators being put here. And this is what it came in the Journal of Hand Surgery here. They said 95% of their patients did extremely well. And because the added advantage of early mobilization. They talked of early mobilization, and this was the picture which came in Journal of Hand Surgery. They immobilized the DIP joint, PIP joint, and they said there's early range of motion. How can you have early range of motion when you have immobilized both the IP joints here? So moral of the story here is, if you can get away successfully with a simple K wire and a plaster of Paris outside, do you really require plates and screws here? I'll skip some of the slides here because we are coming to almost end of the session here. You have a fracture, intra-articular fracture, distal phalanx, 4-part pieces here. There are various options which are available here. Some may try to put a K wire across the joint, causing more stiffness here. Others may put an external fixator here, but both will lead to stiffness of the joint here. There are other options which are available here. Convert this 4-part fixation into 3-part, into 2-part, into a single piece, and then you can achieve a early range of motion rather than immobilizing the IP joint here. What do you do about this thing? You have a fracture of the head of the proximal phalanx here, and the patient presented with a K wire right across the DIP and the PIP joint here. Was it really needed? What was basically needed are shown by the yellow lines here. Probably 2 K wires across the head of the neck of the phalanx would have been adequate. And therefore, it is not the K wire, it is how you have applied the K wire that is more important. K wire immobilized the joints which are not necessarily needed to be immobilized cause more havoc. And therefore, see if you can get a mobility of the fracture site. What about this thing here? What is the surgeon trying to save the wire from cutting so that it can be reused? Or he didn't have a wire cutter? Probably this is the failure of the K wire, or failure of the technique, or the failure of the surgeon. What about this here? This appears to be an alignment. This is a fracture of the base of the dorsal side of the middle phalanx here. And what the surgeon has done, it's put an external fixator here, causing more distraction here. And what was not necessary was fixation of the DIP, PIP joint here. And just a fixation of the distal, the dorsal lip would have been adequate. This caused more stiffness here. And this was not necessary here. And this led to unnecessary, avoidable stiffness. So this is not the failure of the K wire. This is failure of the technique here. What basically was needed was just a simple K wire here. What about this fracture here? What was done was a huge K wire was passed across all the joints here. Probably what was needed was here. And this is not the K wire which has failed. It is the failure of the technique here. What about this? Nicely put 2 K wires here. Looks nice here. But there is a scissoring here. Therefore, again, it is not the failure of the K wire. It is the failure of the interpretation how you have put. The surgeon failed to flex a finger and see if that is not scissoring. And this is definitely an avoidable problem. What about this? Blind K wiring here. A blind K wiring led to this problem. It is much worthwhile opening it, getting the articular surface back into alignment, and then fixing it, rather than having the fixation that I talked to you. And therefore, this is absolutely no. This is not failure of the technique. This is failure of the application of the technique here. I picked it up from the computer here. This is how the patient presented and fixed here. But what is important here is this will lead to a stiffness of the metacarpal phalangeal joint because the fixator has been applied with the extended MP joint. And therefore, again, this is the poor application of the techniques here. What about this? This is unacceptable. Look what has happened to the color of the finger here. This is distraction of the fracture site. This is again not acceptable. This is, you would have put a single K wire here. This would have been adequate here. I'll skip some of the slides because we are coming to the end of the talk. Just before I summarize. In summary, therefore, you need a safe surgeon. Intra-articular fractures, you need acute reduction. Extra-articular fractures, you need minimum fixation. Often K wires would be adequate. In my lifetime, I have not put a plate. Let's be honest. I have not put a plate over any of the phalanges, any of the metacarpals. The only thing you need to see is there is no scissoring here. And you have to start range of motion very early. If somebody says, I'm a good surgeon, I ask the next question, how do you mobilize your fingers? Do you have splints? The moment surgeon says, I don't have splint, I know he is having very stiff hand. And therefore, very important to have early range of motion. I thank you very much for patient listening. Thank you once again.